Welcome, everyone. I think this might be one of the last panels of the day, so if you've stuck with it all through the day, congratulations. We're almost up here and plenty of time left to get to some pressing issues. My name is Annie McDonough. I'm City and State's Tech and Policy Reporter. I also write our First Read Tech email every day. I'm very excited to moderate this panel on sort of the broad topic I like to think of as responsible innovation, essentially the challenge of harnessing technology and data while balancing, proper privacy and security protections for citizens. We have three of the best people in the city to weigh in on this topic here with us today, Alex Foard, Geoff Brown, and Kelly Jin. And before we get too deep into the topic, I want to actually start with their introductions, talk a little bit about what you're working on in the city and how you got to that place. Alex.
Great. You can hear me? Great. So my name is Alex Foard. I'm a senior advisor at the Mayor's Office of Operations. Just to begin, I want to thank Noel and the whole Beta team for having us and for Annie for agreeing to moderate the panel for today. Like I said, I come from the Mayor's Office of Operations. We're a comparatively small office within the city government, centrally located both physically and in terms of administratively where we work. And what we generally do, we often describe as problem solving. We do a lot of fixes for policies and projects that need to be hastily sometimes put together and run. We specialize in cross-agency work, so when multiple agencies have to work together on broader issues, we come in and we often are able to facilitate cross-agency projects. We also have within our Office of Operations a family of other mayor's offices of. One of them is Mayor's Office of Data Analytics, which I'll leave to Kelly to describe. And those offices have their own specialties, which are then sort of centralized and they all coalesce together in the Mayor's Office of Operations space. And we do a lot of work oriented around performance improvement in data. The Office of Operations has its history in the 70s after some serious financial problems in New York City. And so what we do is efficiency and effectiveness in government. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of data that's incorporated into those practices and those projects. And so data is something that we digest and use on a day-to-day basis and that we are stewards of on a day-to-day basis. And we, just a quick note, sort of in addition to our general work, we're really excited about this topic today because as Annie sort of alluded to already, there's a lot of very interesting conversations going on outside of New York City and within New York City about the use of data in government and how to balance using data in innovative and effective ways, but sort of being cognizant of and very much adhering to the norms or regulations around how to protect data and how to protect the users behind those data. So thank you again. I'll pass it on because I've been talking for too long, but thank you again for coming and hearing us today.
Geoff?
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Can you hear me? All right, terrific. So I'm happy to be here this afternoon. Perhaps to me it seems like morning, only because I came over here pretty recently from where all my kids and my wife are, and I had a gigantic cup of coffee before coming. So for me, it's like a new day, and I'm happy to spend it with you guys now. So my name is Geoff Brown. I am the Chief Information Security Officer for the City of New York, and I lead an office called New York City Cyber Command. It's important to sort of give a quick explanation of what Cyber Command is, because it will give you context as we talk today, and perhaps when we get to Q&A, when you ask questions on what that office does and what my perspective is within this very important conversation of the panel, but then also this conversation that you are all involved in as you think about the ramifications of algorithms, data, AI, privacy, security, et cetera. So what is New York City Cyber Command? Very quickly, our goal is to achieve trust. It's that simple. Every single person in New York City Cyber Command will tell you if you ask, what is the goal of New York City Cyber Command? We are an organization that is building to achieve trust. How do we do that? We achieve trust by reaching our mission objectives. Our two mission objectives are as follows. We have what we consider to be an enterprise mission, and that's to defend the technologies that enable services to be delivered through the New York City government agencies to New Yorkers successfully each and every day. You know, if you think about it, all of those great agencies that make up the city government operate now on technology. We need to defend that technology because those services are things New Yorkers rely on. The other key mission is what we consider to be our public-facing mission. And the public-facing mission is to bring cybersecurity to New Yorkers in ways that helps them navigate away from threats that they might find on the internet and in ways that respect the values of all New Yorkers. I'm going to highlight that probably a little bit later in our conversation today because that'll give you a perspective on what I think is achievable, the intersection of security, privacy, technology, data, AI, and you know, the great things that we can actually balance in our future. So last thing I want to mention is when you build an organization like New York City Cyber Command, an office that the de Blasio administration created almost 3 years ago, one of the really important things is to center on the character. So I said in the beginning of my remarks that our goal is to achieve trust. Well, how do we do that? We have a values equation in New York City Cyber Command. It's this simple: facts plus judgment plus culture equals trust. We think if we operate off of facts, we exercise sound judgment, and we have a culture that's reflective of the best value of New Yorkers, then when you work with us and we work with you, we deserve trust. If we break any of those parts of the equation, we don't deserve trust. So that's what New York City Cyber Command is about, and I'm happy to be here with you guys this afternoon.
Thanks. And lastly, Kelly?
Sure. So first off, I just want to say, Geoff, you guys have the coolest office name. I will concede MODA, even though I think that's a pretty cool office name. So hey, everyone, thanks for sticking around throughout all of today. I think at this point, you've probably hopefully gone to a few sessions where you've heard from other staff members and team members within the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics. We work here within the city really primarily on 3 core programs and issue areas. The first is the Open Data program, and actually working in partnership with Do It to run the portal, as well as to support all of you in terms of events like this, and more broadly to support the community here in New York City. So New York City Open Data itself being a core piece and a component of today's celebration is a huge part of the work that we do. Number 2, we work in support of city agencies across the board. If you go onto our website, nyc.gov/analytics, you can take a look at the types of projects we work on. We are really working with city agencies to further data-driven, responsible data-driven decision making. So that's number 2. And then third, but not least in any way, is how can we more smartly and responsibly think about data analytics when it comes to policy. And so that is partly why I'm sitting here on this panel today to chat with folks, is how can we better balance all of the various components that you see here represented throughout the city. And I'll just close very quickly this part by saying, you know, I kind of get the pleasure of working with these guys internally within the city frequently and semi-frequently, so it's just neat to also sit publicly and talk a little bit more about what we do and riff a little bit. So I'll turn it back over to Annie.
Great, thank you all very much. I think, you know, forgive me if I repeat the term responsible innovation too often throughout this panel, but I want to sort of dig into what that means in your current roles for each of you. What are the projects you're working on where you are trying to either within your own office or encouraging other city agencies to adopt new technologies, new ways of doing something, while also, you know, making a concerted effort to ensure that privacy protections are in place, that security is sort of the utmost importance. What are the projects where that balance is sort of at the forefront?
Well, I'll start off by actually just giving a quick little background of one of the other component offices of the Mayor's Office of Operations, which is the Mayor's Office of Information Privacy. It's a newish office, but it's an extremely, extremely important one. And unfortunately, our Chief Privacy Officer for the City of New York, Laura Negron, wasn't able to come today, although her colleague, Kahini Ranade, gave a presentation earlier today. about some of the work that the Mayor's Office of Information Privacy does. Very sort of quick summary before I get a little bit more deeper into that question. That office is responsible for implementation and guidance for the city's local privacy laws. So there are two substantial privacy laws that govern how city agencies collect, use, and disclose identifying information that were passed several years ago. And the framework of those laws is substantial. There's a lot of requirements, a lot of guidance that needs to be produced, a lot of governance over how agencies are thinking about their collection, their usage, and their disclosures of data. A lot of those guidance, pieces of guidance are intended to serve as a bridge between what is often a patchwork of privacy regulations at local, state, and federal levels. So it's intended to be provide more sort of concrete boundaries, parameters, ways of better understanding how identifying information is used. So to get more specifically to your question, my particular role within ops, it tends to be sort of project by project. We all kind of get assigned to portfolios of projects. Mine tend to be the data ones, which is why Kelly and I work very frequently together. And I think first and foremost, this notion of privacy is these days, thanks to Laura Negron's extremely hard work, it is a principle in which we do all of the work that we do, right? So when we're starting a project and you're laying out the various considerations that you need to do a project, what's the budget, what's the staffing levels, what are the tech resources that you're going to need? Privacy has become one of those things that is just, it's automatically a layer through which we understand the projects that we're working on if those projects involve data. So, we don't go more, sort of past a conceptual phase of a project without having brought privacy into the equation of how we think about that project. I think that goes with security as well, though obviously Geoff's cyber command is not within operations, and so that's more of an external relationship that we manage. But we start because we have this collection of offices within our office that really facilitates having these sorts of questions at the forefront. And because ops' projects are all about problem solving, fixing, making things better, innovating, pretty much everything that we're doing is about doing something that was being done before in a better way. And so that's a default of the way that we think about our projects, and now privacy is sort of in parallel from the get-go, a key consideration of all of those projects.
Can I jump in there? So I think there's I'll talk about it from two perspectives for MODA. So one is specifically around our open data program. It is a first and foremost consideration that our open data coordinators, who are staff members at city agencies, who work in partnership with folks throughout their agencies, including their general counsel's offices. They are making sure that any data that they are collecting and then will be releasing online is something that privacy is being reviewed, and personally identifiable information is being reviewed. For those of you who don't know some of the wonky government terms that we're kind of throwing around here up on the panel, PII information, who you are, where you're born, your birth date, where you live, addresses, et cetera. It's super important to us within government that we are guardians of that information, because it is New Yorkers' information, and we're always keeping, as Alex said, that top of mind when we're doing analysis. In terms of a project, actually a continuation of a project that MODA has been working on, I think, for way longer than my tenure, is working in partnership with city agencies on anti-tenant harassment projects. And so this is working in partnership with, today, the Mayor's Office to Protect Tenants, HPD, a couple other agencies, and saying, how can we identify and integrate a couple different data sets and sources to potentially identify bad landlords across the city. I think over time, this kind of work continues to evolve, and I think that's also really important. We'll probably touch on it a little bit here, is that the needs in the moment, the data sets, the systems themselves are constantly dynamic and changing. Like we all know the fast-paced nature of technology. And so it is, I think, oftentimes incumbent upon us, at least the three of us here, to keep apprised of what's going on, what technologies are available. And that is my handoff to Geoff there.
Great. Sometimes when on panels, I just like to track things for the audience. And I just do that via sort of a word scramble. So one of the things I think Alex highlighted, principles are important as you approach this conversation. And then you didn't say these words, but thinking about the custodianship of, as you're looking at data, the Open Data Initiative, there's an obligation, responsibility to be a sound custodian of all that goodness that can happen when the data is open. So, I think those are both really great points. I'll talk really quickly to the question about innovation, the other word, on how we're thinking about it on the public-facing side of NYC Cyber Command. It's something I'm really proud of, to be honest. I think I was with financial services and cybersecurity before and this is something that was entirely unique of an opportunity to build. So many of you might know, but if you don't, you'll know soon. There's an initiative that was launched by the mayor called NYC Secure. NYC Secure really started with principles and said the city of New York government has decided that cybersecurity itself is an essential service with ramifications in the public safety space, and we should do things to help New Yorkers navigate away from threats that they encounter on the internet. But those things we do to help them make those decisions, if they choose to do so, should respect New Yorkers' values. And one of those key values is privacy. Keeping on the innovation theme, speaking a little bit about technology, how did we go about this? We could have started, that was the principal statement, and we could have thought about policies and all these different things we could have done. But there's an organization that we really respect in my office, and we have a great alignment with, called the Global Cyber Alliance, and there's something that they talk about, which is do something and measure it, right? And so we decided to take the do something and measure it approach. So what we did is two main things. The first is we partnered with a non-for-profit technology in what's called the DNS security space, and we deployed that technology to everywhere in the city of New York where the city of New York government is providing free public Wi-Fi. Now, what does that technology do? Importantly, thinking about those values of privacy, those values of New Yorkers, this technology does no categorization. It doesn't decide or choose you can go where you want to go. It doesn't sort of block this site because of a categorization or this site. The only thing it does is, if based on sound threat intelligence, that's something in the cybersecurity industry that says this website is only there to drop malware on your device or steal your credentials or conduct some sort of cybersecurity bad activity. If that's confirmed with high confidence with big major security partners like IBM, et cetera, and there's many others, you can look it up. It's called Quad 9. If it's confirmed that website is going to try and do a cybersecurity bad thing to your device, let's stop that. Let's stop that from happening. We think that that's the right thing to do, and we actually think that more places in the city of New York should avail themselves of this technology. If you walk into a corner coffee shop or a pizza place or a hotel lobby, and you're just taking advantage of their free guest Wi-Fi, and they can do something that's free, that doesn't decide where you're going to go at all, that doesn't capture any of that browsing data and sell it to somebody else, none of that happens. But if all it does is say you're not going to hit that website that's there to victimize your computer, that sounds like the right thing to do. So we did that in everywhere that the city provides that free public Wi-Fi. And then we did something else, which I think goes even more to the core of what we think technology can do in the cybersecurity space. We released what's called the NYC Secure app. So that app is free, and it's at the two major app stores. And you can download it. I have it on my personal device here. And just like the Quad 9 initiative, it doesn't collect any data from your device. Nobody gets that data. When it was built, we made sure at the code verification level, it cannot function in a way to steal any of your privacy, any of your private data. It doesn't send your contacts anywhere. It doesn't do any of that. All it does is it gives you an alert. It doesn't take any action on your phone. It just gives you an alert. If the technology that's inherent on that app, like, triggers that you might have an on-device threat, like, you know, maybe if somehow you visited a website and you've downloaded mobile malware onto your phone, or if you're connecting to a Wi-Fi network that, you know, you might want to be careful on what types of sites you go to, you know, like maybe it's not encrypted, so you shouldn't do your banking transactions or your sensitive health transactions on that website connection. Just alerts you. And the thing that's really cool about this is it is, from a technology standpoint, a harmonization of security and privacy. And we did that for New Yorkers. And those are just our first 2 experiments in this, but our commitment is as we continue to experiment, we want to hear what New Yorkers say, what they think, and we'll respect the values of New Yorkers. And you know, one of those pinnacle values is is privacy. So that goes to like what we think we can do in the innovative space.
And I want to do a quick follow-up for Kelly and Geoff before we move on. Kelly, you said you review PII, personally identifiable information, when for the Open Data portal. When you say review, what does that mean?
So that can take a couple different forms. It is something that our agencies work in partnership, so there's a couple of different staff members. Something that, as you all here probably know, is really important is that we actually are taking a look at the data set itself and how it is constructed. So the actual technical documentation, the metadata elements that are involved, and then actually scanning what those data sets look like. I will say, and I think we have a couple members of Do It here in the audience, that Do It partners very closely with city agencies in order to complete what those steps are. But as you know, there are dozens and dozens of New York City agencies, and each of those agencies do work on that. Their IT agencies and those individuals work on that in partnership with Do It as well as with MODA. I will say, I think what I'm hearing from Geoff and myself as well is that there are a ton of almost like best practices that can continue to be shared between how private sector reviews data sets, let's say for sensitive elements, as well as how private sector can learn from government in the ways that we're implementing security and privacy when we're reviewing data sets. But I don't know, Geoff, you've got anything to add there?
Yeah, I certainly think, and vice versa. I think to a certain extent, you know, we can, of course, learn a lot, and as any cybersecurity organization, whether government or in the private sector, has robust partnerships with different private sector providers of the types of technology that really defend those systems that enable those critical services to be delivered to New Yorkers. So there is a strong partnership there from what we learn, but I think in another, on the flip side, they can learn a lot from us. You know, I've had many conversations, sort of, you know, referring back to my comments about the NYC Secure app, I've had many conversations with the private sector about, you know, the fact that you can deliver a security solution to a degree. You know, there's trade-offs here. To a degree that has a high fidelity capability to alert on threats, but doesn't have to take data off the device and send it elsewhere. So. It's a two-way street, I think, with private sector. You had a...
That's it, actually. But something you mentioned about the NYC Secure app, I'm curious if each of you are thinking about transparency to the public as a goal. You know, looking at the NYC Secure app, one of my first thoughts was, I wonder what data the app would collect. And I think a lot of us here, they can hear Geoff, you tell them that it's not collecting any data. For everyone else who wants to download the app, or sort of, you know, the equivalent of the Open Data portal. Are you thinking about sort of communicating what exactly it is your agencies are working on, you know, and what data is or isn't collected, what privacy protections are in place as a goal? the, broad goal of transparency and sort of, maybe not just transparency, but communication with the public?
I'm happy to start there. Yes, and I think I won't speak on behalf of you both, but I think yes for all three of us, and yes for many of the city agencies, literally here today represented on various panels, but also at large. I think it is something that we know that oftentimes government is busy delivering services and figuring out ways how we can do better for New Yorkers, but it's also constantly having to balance basically being in the service delivery business, but also explaining how are we delivering those services and making some of those decisions as well. There's a few pieces there. I think the first is literally finding forums and building forums for engagement. So this panel is one example, doing Q&A sessions with a broader public. I am continuing to be humbled when I talk to various different audiences, because it is so apparent that even though I think I'm speaking in a really non-technical way, some of the public forums that I've been to and spoken at in the last 18 months or so, I'm like, oh shoot, no, I actually have to figure out how can we talk about the work that we do in a way that really resonates with folks and what people care about within their neighborhoods and communities. So
I found
that's
this on the web.
serious listening to all of us, clearly. And so I think that that's first and foremost in my mind. In terms of transparency, so I will talk about, again, the Open Data program and portal is one of the largest transparency open government platforms out there, not just here in this city, but nationally, and it's something that we frequently get countries calling us from all around the world, asking us how we do what we do. And I believe, I'm looking at Zachary over there, I think we hosted an Open Data Week webinar with Australia live earlier this week during Open Data Week. So it is something that we are trying to engage not just New Yorkers, but more broadly. And then I'll say in terms of MODA, our office's work specifically, we have, if you go to our website, nyc.gov/analytics, we also speak to the work that we do. So you can find the project that I just mentioned earlier, our tenant anti-harassment work, some of our code, our methodology, the literal process by which we spoke with agencies and helped to further their operations. And again, I think that for me is a constant learning of lessons of how on earth are we balancing sharing information with explainability and understandability, because oftentimes we may be, I'm going to count you guys as a bit more of a techie audience here, but how can we talk to different New Yorkers and finding different forums and ways to do that, I think is super, super important. And the last thing I will say is, I think when we talk about government transparency, there are a whole suite of different offices throughout the city. So not just city agencies, but the DORIS, Department of Records and Information Systems, who manages FOIL, and there are many other groups that we are constantly working with, because transparency, again, to me is very much a lane that cuts across different offices and the city government at large. So yeah, those are a couple thoughts from me in response.
Jeff or Alex, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, we talked about privacy as a foundational principle before. Transparency, if not a principle, is even more foundational than that. I don't think you can really have democratic governance without transparency. I think part of the reason we are so interested in this topic of the interplay between transparency, privacy, and security is because when you read about those topics, whether it's about government or private sector, New York or other places, you often hear this narrative that those things are in opposition of one another, and that you either get one or the other, and that there's this impossible reconciliation between those principles. And I think the excitement that we have working in this is we disagree with the fact that there is somehow not a reconciliation point between those. The privacy laws, when you think about the privacy laws that I mentioned earlier, those, of course, are about governing the disclosure of data, which is easy to read as we're not sharing data. But that's actually not what it means. What it means is we're protecting data in places where we think data could be misused. It does not preclude data sharing. It doesn't include the sort of the publishing or the distribution of data either between agencies or other forums. And I think Geoff's the expert here, so I don't want to speak for him, but I think similar concept for security. Just because you have interests in making sure that data are protected from a security point of view doesn't mean that it's prohibitive of other means of communicating and sharing that data. In the open data space, as Kelly's already alluded to, there are tons of open data sets out there where the PII has been anonymized or stripped, or other ways of being able to still make that product digestible that doesn't come at the expense of individual privacy or organizational security. So, as optimistic as we are, or excited as we are about that topic, I would not claim that we've necessarily threaded the needle all the way. I think it's an ongoing discussion. I think it's something that New York City government is grappling with actively and productively by having somebody like the chief privacy officer who's sitting there and contributing to a lot of innovative conversations. But there's balance that can be had, and I think that it would be sort of not to anybody's advantage to just assume that there's really this full opposition between transparency on one side and privacy and security on the other side. If anything, robust privacy and security actually enables better transparency. If you know what the principles of privacy and security are, then you know what is permissible. So I think that's the place that we operate from.
Got it. Geoff, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, certainly. Really two threads. First, really just thinking very much from a business of New York City Cyber Command perspective. As everyone might expect, we do value a high degree of transparency. I'll talk about that in a second. And with that said, of course, since we're a security organization tasked with defending the technologies of the city government, there's a bunch of stuff that we don't talk about, right? And I think New Yorkers wouldn't want us to talk about that because that's part of our strategic advantage, is what we're doing to defend those technologies. With that said, the organization is really considerate about how within the security industry as a whole, different partners have a lack of certain sort of test data sets, at the university level, et cetera, where in order to build better defensive solutions, you need to test against data. So we're pretty cognizant of that, and talking to some of our university partners on how to be a good partner to help them build better technologies that will, defend the systems that we care about. So that's my sort of enterprise answer. And then when I think about, again, go back to the word game, we've been hearing sort of the Open Data Initiative, transparency. I like this phrase, protect against misuse. And then just for a moment, we heard Siri chime in and say, I found that on the web. And if I was dive a little bit into that, I think a lot of times someone in my type of position always gets, I'm going to steal this from you guys. In Q&A, the first question that a cybersecurity panel always gets is what keeps you up at night, right? It's the first question I get every single time, so I always steal it back. I ask myself that first question. But one of the things to be considered about as we build a better future for New Yorkers in the technology space is something that keeps me up at night. And that answer is what keeps me up at night a little bit when we think about open data, putting the data out there. And the reason why is a lot of cybersecurity professionals are always concerned with, going back to your friends, protecting that data set against its possible misuse. As we look at the landscape, I'll harken back to the equation of my organization that I said before. The first thing we think about is facts. And trusting the data, the actual clarity of the data that you're going to run your experiment against or you're going to make a decision on is really, really important. And unfortunately, everybody in this room knows, unfortunately, there are people out there with intent counter to the values of the city who are trying to manipulate those data sets in order for us to make us make different types of decisions that may not be made based on facts. So when I think about how we responsibly disclose all kinds of things in a very transparent manner, respecting privacy, I think as a society, not just the city government of New York, we have to really, really think about how we'll be very clear on what data sets are factual and what data sets maybe purposely put there to mislead us. So I already answered the what keeps me up at night in the future. I already answered that one. You guys have to think about a different first question.
I will say, audience members, feel free to ask Alex or Kelly that question if
Fair
you
enough.
have it. Alex, I'm going to use you as a surrogate for, which may be fair or unfair, you can disagree. We had a discussion just prior to this about the Algorithms Task Force, the ADS Task Force, and I'm going to use you as a surrogate for the new office of the Algorithms Management and Policy Officer. I'm curious how this fits into what operations is doing already, and maybe more pressingly, right out of the gate, what is that role going to be producing for the public? What kind of information about algorithms currently in use?
Sure. So that new role, I think, is extremely emblematic of the conversation we just wrapped up. This notion of how do you balance innovation, use of data, transparency, privacy, and fairness. So really exciting time to be looking at that. As you know, really New York City at the moment is leading that conversation in terms of activity with our AMPO, which is our rough little, our acronym that's a little bit rough, but as far as we know, there isn't another one of those in any city in the US. So it is a perfect time to be talking about this intersection between how we're able to think about transparency, how we're able to think about privacy, and fairness with some very direct parallels to open data and then some departures from the open data process. A lot of the work over the past few months for the AMPO within the Office of Operations has been very administrative. You know, the executive order that created the AMPO sort of outlined some administrative steps that needed to be taken. So, you know, we've got resources within the Mayor's Office of Operations that from a project management perspective are getting things ready. The reason to have the AMPO within the Mayor's Office of Operations is really, a smart one, which is to say, you know, I mentioned earlier, we've got MODA, we've got Mayor's Office of Information Privacy, we have this huge project management team within operations. It's just this repository of different perspectives in multiple disciplines who can have really meaningful conversations and influence about what we're thinking about for AMPO work. In addition to that, the executive order outlines not just one, but two advisory committees, one that we call a steering committee, of which these two are representatives, that helps to serve the purpose there is to guide the algorithms officer in general policy areas and other things that may influence the algorithm conversation. The idea sort of there is that, you know, Kelly may be in a conversation with an agency about a specific project, and that has bearing on guidance that potentially could come out of the AMPO. And we want that forum so that, you know, we don't have algorithms in this space, analytics in this space, you know, privacy in this space. We want to be able to have flows of information across those. There's also an advisory committee that's public-facing, so with appointees coming from the public, that will have public meetings twice a year. One of the AMPO's key responsibilities is public engagement and public education, not just actually having opportunities to gain information from the public, but to actually put together educational material, since the world of algorithms can be a little bit wonky sometimes. And so right now, really the focus, like I said, we've been spending a couple months on the administration of, you know, for I don't know how many people of you are in government, but government hiring takes a long time. So there's a lot of lead time for that sort of administrative piece. But we're really excited about some upcoming next steps in terms of starting to think about what the guidance from the AMPO is actually going to look like. The executive order outlines what exactly the AMPO needs to provide guidance on, you know, how to identify and prioritize tools, how to, like I said, how to construct a public engagement platform, how to channel or construct a means by which you can channel information bi-directionally from agencies to the public and from the public to agencies. So a lot of that guidance is we're sort of queuing it up to be ready to be actually implemented. And we're looking forward to a lot of input from different spaces. Shameless plug that we have a feedback form on the AMPO website. So if you have anything that you want to say about it, you should actually contribute. So,
And am I correct?
Alex, do you want to plug
sorry.
the website?
oh, sorry, nyc.gov/AMPO. So,
There you go. Am I correct that under the executive order creating the AMPO, one of the responsibilities is to produce a complete list of what ADS systems are currently in use, or is that a misreading?
well, it's not a misreading. It's here's where the open data comparison is both helpful and then it departs a little bit. So the open data world is, this repository of data sets, right? So as Kelly alluded to earlier, it's not as simple as going to an agency to say, hey, give us this data set, right? You have to work with an agency, understand the data infrastructure, understand the business use behind the data, get feedback from the public about whether or not that data is even helpful, and if that data is not helpful, what data they would prefer instead. And your result is a repository of information that's in different segments, right? So you've got your landing page, and then you've got search capabilities, and you have the actual data sets themselves. So the first and foremost for the AMPO, for sure, within the executive order, is making information available to the public about the algorithmic tools that New York City uses. That's like foundational to the work that the AMPO is going to be doing. I think that right now there's probably still some interesting brainstorming to do about what form that takes. Kelly will tell you sort of in terms of the open data platform, as New York has vastly more data sets than any other city, that searching becomes more complex. With the more you add to it, the more complex it gets. That like 311 data set has like 22 million rows or something like that. There's a lot that goes into thinking about format and form and structure.
And usability.
And usability, yes, yeah. And that goes back to the whole public education component too, right? It's one thing to say, here's an algorithm. It's another to say, do you understand what I mean when I give you this algorithm, right? And an algorithm is not a tangible thing in and of itself. It's more complex than that. It's got sort of a different set of components. But first and foremost, of course, is giving New Yorkers information about the tools that are in use.
We have a little bit of time for questions before we wrap up. Are there any questions from the audience? In the back there.
Yeah. How do you prioritize which initiatives you choose with all of the different departments and their competing needs?
Is that
General question for...
Yeah, I mean, like, do you go and do you ask them, like, hey, do you guys care about response time? Do you guys care about routing and efficiency? Like, how do you determine what the objectives are of the functional units and then align the algorithmic, cybersecurity, and data programs that you're working on with the functional units?
Sure, I can take the first crack there. So there's a few elements to consider, I think, for anyone here who either works within a small but nimble, and I see a couple of you directors of analytics teams out there from city agencies. We have small offices, so at least the mayor's office of data analytics, we are a small but nimble team of 11. And so when you do think about the fact that we are running and working in partnership with Do It on the open data program, and there's public correspondence, we're helping to run elements of today's conference, there are things that we're constantly balancing day to day. In terms of selection criteria for actual projects and what we end up taking on and not taking on, I would point you all to think about selection criteria that may be true of any analytics projects, whether that's within government or private sector as well. And so I like to oftentimes ensure that there is executive sponsorship. So making sure that this isn't just, hey, we've done some analysis, we think it's interesting, but making sure that there's a handoff point, that we've completed analysis and that this will help to improve operations, or that there is a commitment that there will be follow through to take up those recommendations and help implement them. That's one component to think about. Another component is that we, throughout all of our work, do think a lot about what makes services and life more equitable for New Yorkers. So thinking about what the impact is and scale of the work, I think, is critically important. The size of our agencies throughout New York City and the size of our services, depending on those agencies, vary pretty significantly across the board. We don't have a hard and fast rule there, other than we have a open email address. You know, my phone is always on, and we do work pretty closely with city agency leadership to figure out what those needs are. And last thing I'll say, I could continue on. I have like 5 hours worth of thoughts on selection criteria for analytics projects, and Alex, I think, has heard most of those 5 hours, is that I think it's also really important that MODA, but even some of the offices up here, we are not the only source of resources across the city. So city agencies are now building up their own data and analytics, performance management, cybersecurity expertise in-house. And so some of our best projects are us working in partnership with analysts that exist already within their ecosystem, within their analytics agency. So we are coming in and serving more as advisors, more as added capacity, because I'll say, again, it is super humbling when you walk in and you have analysts or even staff who've operationally been there for 20 plus years. They know that world way better than I could get up to speed in even a couple months. And so making sure that you're balancing those components is always really, really important. But yes, I think about that a lot all the time.
Anybody else want to weigh in, or don't have to?
Yeah, I would basically just echo all of that and really say, I mean, our offices, again, are sort of positioned close to the center of government administration within New York City, which means that we're sort of at an advantage of seeing issues from above, right? So because we're not in agency operations on a day-to-day, it's sometimes a helpful vantage point to see, where things could be made more efficient or more effective. But a lot of the nature of government work is, oh, this thing is happening, deal with it, in which case we drop what we're doing and we deal with it. But I would say that's actually probably, if I can plug again, an advantage of an office like ours is that people get a real range of opportunities in a world of different policy areas to work on. So if you're interested, go to the operations website and there's tons of jobs, so you should look.
And you get to work with us.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
In the white there in front?
Hello. Hi. So there was a panel before this that talked about like the future of open data, and they kind of mentioned this idea of giving more public collection to the public, with government kind of being the checker, because since the public is the one giving this data, they're inclined to do it because they care about it more, and government is way too spread out to really collect every single data point that can possibly be in a city. And I think the topic of like what is a fact within data, because how you interpret data is differently how a city versus the public and the user is. And I think you mentioned fact a lot within you're talking about the data, so how you look at it. And within that theory of like using the public to collect data, how would like innovation and security like mix? Because I know you've been talking about this in the very beginning about how, collecting can only be the government's job, but it can be the checker of it to protect, what gets published and what gets that certification of saying like this is okay to use. So I guess my idea is like innovation within open data. How do you keep innovating without slowing this progress forward?
I'm happy to try.
Yeah.
It's a very thoughtful question.
Yeah.
And a tough question, because I think it's something not just New York City, but society at large struggles with as we populate the internet with what's accessible. Like, as you note, my comment earlier was really about like how do you trust what you're reading on the internet, right? But you have a very thoughtful point, and this is not this. I'm only going to give an example because I think it's an intelligent way of approaching that perhaps is also akin to what you're talking about. So, and I may get parts of this, not entirely right on the money, but I'm aware within the space of journalism that there is a high degree of attention being paid by technologists on where people get trusted sources of, journalistic product. And I know I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's an organization called the Global Cyber Alliance that we're affiliated with, and they're affiliated with the Craig Newmark Foundation, which has spun up a couple different efforts in this space specifically to start to examine technical solutions that can be brought to bear on the online that people can then use to verify the veracity of the source that they're getting their news from, right? And in some senses, I think that is at least an example that points towards ways where it's not just government, but it's also academia or the society at large will be asking for that custodianship, that checker process, because people do recognize the threat when you're not quite sure if the thing you're reading is real, right? So I think we're seeing some light to your question. I'm encouraged to hear that it's being discussed at the previous panel. I caught the last section of it. I didn't hear this part of the conversation, but I mean, it's very encouraging that both government and the society at large is thinking through this very important way of how we're going to interact with the internet moving forward. I know that doesn't answer, it just gives some thoughts about it.
Yeah, I'm just curious if that's in the timeline, because you guys are actively working in space, and is there something coming up or even maybe very far down the pipeline is something that is being thought out of?
I think I'll point you to two resources. One is Zachary Fader, MODA Open Data Program Manager, sitting over there. Now he's raised his hand, so you can find him after the panel session, or I think in the next couple hours as well. Cool. And then the second is we have outlined, so there's elements of what you've covered in our Next Decade of Open Data report that we released last year in 2019, which this gentleman here this is great. I wish I could just point to folks during more panels. But it is something that we are thinking about. What are some broader citizen science initiatives where folks are collecting information? Because I think, at least for our open data portal, it is right now a resource for New Yorkers about New York City with data from city agencies. I would love to see it get more to a point where you can go to find information about New York City itself at large. Because I think for a lot of folks, that delineation is really hard to understand of, like, between city agencies or between all these different data sets, who kind of owns what. And so that is something I would love to move us generally toward. I think there's a lot of work underway in order for that to happen. And I'll just also quickly say that I think there's been a lot of analogs over time, over the last couple decades, of what happens when you unleash and unlock the power of a lot of open data, most notably weather data. I think for anyone who's paid attention to what the National Weather Service released however many decades ago, the fact that there's an entire industry and TV channel and applications all derived out of free data that the government is providing. That to me is the really, really high bar of innovation. Like, no one could have predicted that. And I still think, we've been posting open data on the site for 10 years. That's still a very short time period. It's long in technology terms, but there's still a lot for us to innovate on and kind of learn from in the next couple of years as well. So
I think we have time for one more question in blue in front here.
So I don't mean to end on a downer, but one of the things that I understand is that people find information on the open data platform difficult to digest or use because it's so siloed by each agency. And I want to echo something that Gail Brewer said earlier, which is that city agencies not only produce these data sets, but are actually a high-level consumer of these data sets, which only reinforces to me, I mean, I already knew that, but it reinforces how important it is. But I, as a citizen, may want to know about X, but the only way to find out about X is if I personally analyze or somehow marry or contrast data sets that are so segregated based on the integrity of like, it's from here, it's from here, it's from there, that it almost acts as a barrier as opposed to an invitation, because everything is so, whatever is like 20,000 columns for TLC or whatever the example was you gave earlier. So how to balance it to make it not just accessible to people, but make it actually usable and useful to people who are maybe not as technologically savvy as like those of us in the room.
Before like the specific open data component of that, that's a really important concept that you're bringing up that actually predates open data. So something else that we do in the Mayor's Office of Operations is the Mayor's Management Report, which is a report that's required by law, by local law, where twice a year the city has to put out a report that's mostly, this huge list of metrics from agency to agency. And one of the key complaints in terms of users of that report is exactly what you brought up. It's by agency, which works if you work for the government and know that this agency does this and this agency does that, and it's much less helpful for thinking about policy from a different lens, whether that's a different audience lens or a different purpose lens. I don't think that there's a singular answer for it yet, and I'll pass to Kelly for the specifics of open data, but I think that's where feedback from users is particularly important. And that's where data integration concepts are particularly important, because then it's not just about understanding data sets as they are, but how data sets interact with other data sets. And that actually can be a problem for the city too when it's doing work.
Can I ask how users can give feedback on the Open Data Portal?
Okay, a couple quick plugs before Noel closes or turns off all of our microphones. So number one, definitely not, okay, he's going that way. Number one, not a downer in any way. This is something that from our perspective, we have heard everyone loud and clear through the co-creation process, through feedback. You can go onto our website, nyc.gov/opendata, and there is a feedback form. You can get in contact with us. I think at this point, half of my team is also on various forms of social media, so you can always get in contact with us. It's a very straightforward way of doing it. Again, not a downer. What I will say, there's a few things that we've committed to as of last year. One is improving search, because I think for the everyday New Yorker, we definitely understand that even those data scientists and computer scientists struggle oftentimes when they're looking through the portal and are trying to do analysis, and they're both inside of, I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads, inside of the city at city agencies, but also public, academics, researchers, et cetera. So we certainly want to shorten that time frame so that folks spend a little bit less time on discovery. And then I will say that in the last couple days, the 2 Sigma Data Clinic has, as a result of civic engagement and working in partnership with MODA, Do It, and city agency partners, has literally built a tool on top of our open data portal to assist with this search so that you can join and look across columns. There is better fuzzy matching across various data sets, and so I encourage you to check it out. The website shortcut is 2sigma.com/scout, SCOUT. And it is, I believe, in an alpha or a beta version right now, but really encourage you guys to check it out. I've been playing around in the last couple days, and it's already giving me a lot of really unique insights that I haven't seen before. So more soon around that in 2020.
Thank you. I think we are over time officially. I want to thank our panelists and everyone in the audience for their questions, for joining us. Thank you very much. Noel is not here, so any closing thoughts very quickly before I let everyone go? And then
talking.
I could get in trouble. We'll worry about that when it happens. Closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would say there are a lot of open questions that we've talked about, questions about access to data, like we were just talking about, security of data, privacy, transparency. I think we come from a little bit of an optimistic place, which is that there are resolvable answers to these questions, and it may take a long time, and it may take really complex conversations, and we may get it wrong first and then have to go back and do it again. But we're really operating from a position that there is a middle ground, and there's a way to balance all of these competing forces in a way that is good for government as an operation, and then also good for residents. And at the risk of being a little bit rosy about it, I think it's achievable.
So one last parting thought from me. Just want to echo, definitely not a downer question. Public discourse is absolutely essential to the success of democracies, the success of this city, and keep asking those questions. That's important. So thank you, from my perspective, for allowing me to be a participant in the public discourse today.
And I will close by saying what keeps me up at night is that talent in government is super important, especially here in New York City and local government. All of these teams up here that you'll see are hiring.
Yes,
And so please check out the NYC Gov website around jobs. And I think that to me is the pipeline in, the literal people you've seen up here who've been convinced at one point or another to work for government and keep coming back. It's super important that we have a lot of folks who have the latest understanding around industry, technology, data, and analytics, so that can help inform how government operates and deliver services better for New Yorkers. So if you haven't thought about that, definitely please do.
And when you work for local government, you're having the most impact, because it's literally you who you're governing. So.
Thank you very
Now
much.
we're- now we're-
There's no. Thank you.